Every time that Trump gets bad news, it's always good for us. There's a column about good news written in the shadow of the worst news imaginable, and like many people, the mass shooting of children in Uvalde, Texas is basically the only thing that we've been reading about for days on end. But as we've all marinated in the horror and increasingly enraged at the police response, we've also, all of us have been aware of the way our media experience works today. How we are constantly cycled from one crisis to another, each one seemingly existential and yet seemingly forgotten when the wheel turns and the headlines change. Now, climate change, systemic racism, toxic masculinity, online disinformation, gun violence, police violence, the next Trump Klan attack, the latest COVID-19 variant, and the death of democracy, and climate change again. This is the Democratic crisis list. The conservative list is different, but for everyone there are relatively few opportunities to take a breath and acknowledge when anything actually gets better. So the next column will be about the darkness in Texas and the possible policy response. In this one, we want to acknowledge that in a different zone of existential agitation, things just meaningfully improve. Now in Georgia, the state at the center of the 45th squatters' attempt to defy the public will and stay in office. There were 2 Republican primary races that doubled as referendums on the Trumpian demand that GOP officials follow him into a constitutional crisis, and in both of them, his candidate lost badly. The higher profile race was the battle for the gubernatorial nomination between Kemp and David Perdue. Kemp won in an extraordinary rout, but the more important one was the Republican primary for Secretary of State, in which Brad Raffensperger, the special target of Donald Trump's strong-arm tactic and his public ire, defeated Jody Hice, Trump's candidate, and did so without a runoff. Probably some crossover Democratic votes helped push him over 50%, but most of his voters were Republican who listened to his challenger's constant talk of voter fraud and decided to stick with the guy who stood up to Trump. Now, the Kemp victory was to be expected. The easy Raffensperger win was less so. And certainly it wasn't expected at this time last year, but then, even if you pointed out all the Republicans and positions that really mattered in the aftermath of the 2020 election across multiple states and multiple offices, they did their jobs and decided to not go and declined to go along with Donald Trump. The usual response was maybe it happened once, but it wouldn't happen again, but because Trump's anonymity was guaranteed a career ender. Now that narrative, happily, has been exploded. Any Republican in a key swing state office that come 2024 can look at Kemp and Raffensperger and know that they have a future in GOP politics. Now, if, in the event of a contested election, they simply do their job. Now, moreover, the primary balloting in Georgia saw record early voting turnouts and no evidence of meaningful impediments to voting, which exploded a different crisis narrative that took hold on the Democratic side and in corporate America and the Biden White House. When the state passed new voting regulations last year, according to that narrative, and in trying to address the paranoia of their own constituents, Republicans were essentially rolling back voting rights, even recreating Jim Crow era on steroids, to quote the president, or squad, or whatever they decide to. And there was very little good evidence for this narrative at the time, and even less evidence in the turnout rate for the Georgia primary, where early voting numbers were higher than it was back in 2020. Now, Jim Crow on steroids should be stricken from the crisis cycle, but it does not exist. Now, on the other hand, the Trumpian peril, the risk of election subversion and constitutional crisis, still does exist. Now, Doug Mastriano's recent primary victory in Pennsylvania proves as such, and there may be other swing state nominees like Mastriano can't be trusted to imitate Kemp and Raffensperger in their clutch. Now, the results in Georgia prove that the faction that elevates figures like Mastriano does not have a simple veto in the party. It shows the effectiveness of what you might call a stay-and-govern strategy of dealing with Trump's hold on the GOP, one with wide application as the party moves toward 2024, and it indicates the limits of the all-or-nothing thinking that a crisis mentally imposes. We can easily imagine an alternative timeline where Raffensperger resigned his office rather than standing for re-election, and inking a deal with MSNBC, and turned his subsequent book into a mega bestseller, in the style of so many Trump administration exposés, and adopted Biden's administration talking points to denounce Georgia election laws. That timeline would have been unquestionably better for Raffensperger, some family's bank account, and it would have prompted many Democrats to hail him as a profile and Republican courage. But for everyone else out there, and even for the Georgian people, like the GOP, the country, that timeline would have been worse. But whereas, because he stayed in the party, he ran again and won, even in a dark week for America, one region of our common life looks a little better, and one of our crises should feel a little bit less dire. Now, if you liked the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just a little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.